Rationing is not just a choice in the Alaskan wilderness. It is survival. Out here, if you run out of supplies, there is no quick trip to the corner store, no aisles of brightly lit supermarkets waiting to be explored. Every decision counts and every mistake carries consequences. For most, this way of life would be unthinkable, but for Edna Korth, it has always been simply life. When viewers first met her on The Last Alaskans, she came across as steady and calm, never demanding the spotlight. Unlike others who embraced the camera, she often slipped quietly into the background, supporting her husband, Heimo, and keeping her family together. Yet those who looked closer noticed more: the slight distance in her eyes, the quiet weight she carried, and in later years, a sadness that seemed to linger beneath her smile. Her story is not just about survival in Alaska's harshest landscapes. It is about resilience, tragedy, and the bittersweet reality of watching a world you love slowly fade away. Edna was born on January 25, 1954 in Savonga, a small Eskimo village on St. Lawrence Island, set deep in the Bering Sea just 36 miles from Russia's Chukchi Peninsula. Life there was not easy, but it was deeply rooted in tradition and harmony with the land. While children elsewhere in America played with dolls and dreamed of suburban comforts, Edna's world was defined by hunting, trapping, fishing, and the daily rituals of survival. She followed her father and uncle into the wild, learning to set traps and catch fish beneath the ice. In the kitchen, she stood beside her mother, preparing whatever the season gave them, knowing every meal was the result of hard work. Her childhood was lit not by television screens or neon lights, but by the soft glow of kerosene lamps and the moonlight reflected across frozen seas. She listened to her father tell stories of brave hunters and cunning heroes, and from those tales, she drew her earliest lessons in resilience. She grew up understanding that good things took time, that patience, endurance, and quiet strength would carry her further than speed or shortcuts. Even from a young age, Edna knew she was not like other girls. She spoke with the calm wisdom of someone decades older, carried herself with quiet confidence, and never once longed to leave her village for a so-called better life in the city. Civilization to her seemed suffocating. The artificial lights of the modern world blinded people to the gifts of the natural one. She loved the moon because in the wilderness its light meant freedom. It meant she could work, travel, and see even in the dark. She embraced the wild with open arms and dreamed not of leaving it, but of raising children one day who would love it just as she did. But life, no matter how prepared you are, has a way of bringing tragedy to even the strongest spirits. In her youth, Edna found love with a Swedish biologist who shared her passion for the outdoors. They became engaged and planned a life together. When she learned she was pregnant with their first child, she was filled with hope. Yet just as quickly, her dreams were shattered. Her fiancé was killed in a plane crash before their baby was even born. Edna was left devastated, carrying both her grief and the responsibility of raising her daughter, Millie, alone. For years, she seemed to give up hope of ever finding someone who could truly share her world again. But fate had other plans. It was in the 1970s that she met Heimo, a young man from Wisconsin who had left his farm life behind in search of something more. Restless and unsatisfied with the confines of modern living, he was drawn to the wilderness like a calling. At first, he failed miserably, nearly starving to death on his first attempt to live as a trapper. But instead of giving up, he sought knowledge and found it in the people of Savonga. Edna's family welcomed him, teaching him the skills he lacked, and over time he and Edna grew close. At first they were simply friends. She was still healing from her loss and he was still finding his place. But slowly, respect and trust blossomed into love. By the early 1980s, Edna and Heimo were married, and together they began their life deep in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The wilderness tested them constantly. Freezing temperatures, unpredictable rivers, dangerous wildlife, and the sheer loneliness of living 100 miles from the nearest neighbor made survival a daily challenge. Yet Edna was never deterred. She and Heimo were not just husband and wife. They were partners who relied on each other for survival. Together, they raised children in the wild, teaching them the skills they themselves had mastered. But once again, tragedy struck. In 1984, while canoeing, their 2-year-old daughter Colleen was swept away by the river's current. Despite desperate searches, her body was never found. The loss was crushing, and for a time it seemed unbearable. Friends and family urged Edna and Heimo to abandon the wilderness and return to civilization, but they refused. For Edna, leaving would have been surrendering to the very land that had taken her daughter. Instead, they built a memorial on a hill, marking it with a cross, and to this day, they return to honor her memory with flowers and silence. Though the pain never fully healed, Edna carried on. She raised her other daughters, Rhonda and Kryn, teaching them self-reliance, patience, and resilience. She worked side by side with Heimo, often saving him in moments of danger, offering him the wisdom he sometimes lacked. She became a quiet icon, a woman admired not for her loudness but for her strength. To those who watched The Last Alaskans, she seemed like the steady heartbeat of her family, the force that kept everything together. Yet time changes even the strongest. In recent years, those closest to her began to see shifts. Her movements slowed, her laughter softened, and her eyes carried a weight of sadness. Part of it came from the inevitable passage of time, the recognition that her children were growing older, moving away, and building lives of their own. But part of it came from something larger, the knowledge that her life in the refuge was coming to an end. When the U.S. government established the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in 1980, it banned new human settlements, allowing only a handful of families to remain under limited permits. For decades, Edna and Heimo were among those rare few who could still call the refuge home. But the countdown was always there, and now the end is near. The land they loved will eventually return to silence, free of human presence. Their children and grandchildren will never inherit it. And for Edna, who spent nearly half a century shaping her life around it, this truth is heartbreaking. Edna Korth's story is one of triumphs and tragedies, of love and loss, of resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. She is a woman who gave her life to the wilderness, who raised her children in a place most would never dare to tread, and who endured grief that would have broken others. Yet she carried on, embodying the quiet strength of her people and the timeless lessons of the land. Now, as she grows older and the wilderness she loves slips from her grasp, she faces her hardest truth, that even the strongest spirits cannot hold back time. Still, her legacy endures. In her daughters, in her grandchildren, and in the countless lives touched by her story, Edna Korth will always remain a symbol of resilience, determination, and the unbreakable bond between a woman and the wild.